Hello, my friends. Tonight, I want you to pause for a moment and really look at the world around us. For nearly 4 long years, the war in Ukraine has been wrapped in slogans, headlines, and political theater. We've been told what to think, who the hero is, who the villain is, and which side must win at all costs. But behind the cameras, behind the speeches, a harsh reality is breaking through. Ukraine is collapsing on the battlefield. Russia is advancing, and Western leaders are trapped inside their own illusion. While soldiers fight and die, European elites fly from conference to conference, promising peace with one hand and pumping weapons with the other. They talk about diplomacy, yet prepare for a war they can't control. They demand Russia surrender while ignoring every signal that Russia is nowhere near backing down. So tonight, let's wipe away the propaganda. Let's take an unfiltered look at what's really happening, why the balance of power has shifted decisively, why Europe refuses to face the truth, and how this dangerous delusion could drag millions into a catastrophe no one voted for. This is the story the media refuses to tell you. This is the truth behind the war in Ukraine and why the West is now desperately trying to force Russia to submit, forcing Russia to submit. That is the central fantasy driving the Western establishment, and especially Europe. It is less a strategy than an illusion, really a form of self-delusion. And what makes it so disturbing is that they cling to this fantasy in the face of battlefield realities that are now impossible to ing. Look at what is actually happening on the ground. Russian forces continue to press forward all along the front. Avdiivka and its surroundings are collapsing into Russian hands. Chasiv Yar is under increasing pressure. Kupiansk and its surrounding areas are effectively under Russian control. Along the Zaporizhia front, the line is steadily shifting westward toward Kherson and the Black Sea. Russian positions are more secure than at any time since the early months of the conflict. Town after town, sector after sector, Ukraine is ceding ground. If you look at the map, honestly, you cannot escape the conclusion that Russia is advancing and Ukraine is in. Overlay that with the diplomatic track. President Trump is pushing for some kind of negotiated settlement meetings in Miami, conversations in Paris, contacts moving back and forth. On paper, you would think this is the moment when reality finally forces Western leaders to admit what they have refused to accept for almost 4 years. Ukraine cannot win this war on the battlefield, and the only rational path is a political settlement that reflects the actual balance. And yet, the European political class refuses to live in the cation. Listen to the rhetoric. Kaja Kallas, the EU's chief foreign policy figure, announces that this could be a pivotal week for diplomacy, and in nearly the same breath declares that Russia does not want peace, and therefore Europe must make Ukraine as strong as possible militarily. Think about what she is actually saying. On one hand, she claims we stand on the brink of a diplomatic breakthrough. On the other, she insists that Russia has no interest in peace and that the response must be more arms, more militarization, more escalation. You cannot have it both ways. If this is truly a pivotal week for diplomacy, that implies there is some convergence of positions, some narrowing of the gap, some willingness to compromise. Yet everything she describes points in the opposite direction. The Ukrainian position has not softened. The European position has not softened. The American position has not softened. Russia's position certainly has not softened. The gap is not narrowing, it's widening. So on what logical basis can anyone claim we are on the verge of a diplomatic turning point? The only way that makes sense is if you quietly redefine the phrase pivotal week for diplomacy to mean something much narrower. Not diplomacy between Russia and the West, but diplomacy within the Western camp itself, more coordination among Europeans and Americans on how to keep the war going, how to arm Ukraine further, how to manage the optics. In other words, a pivotal week not for peace, but for extending the conflict under a new political narrative. And Kaja Kallas makes that perfectly clear when she speaks in another setting the same day. There, She talks not about peace, but about European defense, about ramping up military readiness, about capability coalitions for air defense and drones, about concrete projects in the first half of next year. She says openly that Europe has little time to act, that Russia is unlikely to honor any agreement for long, and that Europe must build up its own military power accordingly. Remember who is speaking here. This is not a defense minister. This is the diplomatic head of the European Union, the person whose very job is supposed to be seeking negotiated settlements. And she is effectively saying, whatever deal we sign with Russia, they will not respect. So we must prepare now for the next phase of confrontation. If you are sitting in Moscow and listening to that, why would you trust any negotiation with these people? What incentive would you have to compromise? The diplomatic leadership of the EU is saying, in public and on the record, that any agreement with Russia is temporary at best and will be followed by further NATO and EU militarization aimed at containing or weakening Russia. That is not diplomacy. That is a declaration that diplomacy is merely a pause between rounds of conflict. Then you have the British media and NATO officials piling on with their own fantasies. One article trumpets a blueprint on how to defeat Putin and build a better Ukraine, including the astonishing claim that peace provides a chance for political change and even reform inside Russia. Think about that logic. They want peace not as a mutual settlement between sovereign states, but as a tactical pause that allows them to undermine and overthrow the Russian leadership. They talk as though Russia will sign an agreement that gives the West time and space to reorganize, rearm, and destabilize Moscow politically. On top of that, a senior NATO commander, an Italian admiral chairing NATO's military committee, talks about preemptive action against Russia's so-called hybrid warfare. Drone incursions, cyber attacks, sabotage in Europe. Maybe some of these accusations are true. Maybe all of them are true. Let's grant that for the sake of argument. But in what universe is it surprising that Russia would respond through asymmetric or hybrid means to a policy in which NATO countries have spent years funneling weapons, ammunition, targeting data, and intelligence into Ukraine with the explicit purpose of killing Russian soldiers? We have used Ukraine as a proxy to bleed Russia. We have moved NATO infrastructure steadily eastward. We have sanctioned their economy, seized their assets, and declared their state and leadership illegitimate. And yet we act outraged that Russia might retaliate in ways short of open war. It's like a schoolyard bully who thinks he can punch someone in the face, kick him in the ribs, hit him again in the mouth, and then scream, "Outrage!" when the victim finally swings back. That is the mindset of the Western political class right now. They want total freedom to hit Russia and absolutely no consequence when Russia hits back. When there is a response, even limited, deniable, hybrid, they talk about reestablishing deterrence and needing to escalate further. This is how wars slip out of control. When NATO officials talk about preemptive action against Russia for hybrid warfare, what do they actually have in mind? More sabotage inside Russian territory? Cyber strikes on critical infrastructure? A tit-for-tat campaign in the gray zone that slowly erodes the line between hybrid conflict and open kinetic war? Russia is watching all of this. Russia is drawing its own red lines. And sooner or later, if the West keeps pushing, one of those lines will be crossed, possibly in a way that neither side intended. All of this unfolds while Western media runs headlines like, Ukraine peace talks shift to Moscow. The big unknown is whether Putin will play ball. Play ball? According to whom? According to the same people who refuse to accept that Russia is winning on the battlefield and has no intention of surrendering its core demands. Play ball in this context simply means, will Russia submit to Western terms to a 19-point or 28-point plan drafted in Brussels or Washington that effectively erases Russia's gains and preserves NATO's long-term leverage over Ukraine? Meanwhile, American officials, like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, emerge from meetings with Ukrainian negotiators and offer nothing but empty phrases. There's more work to be done. It's delicate. It's complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. And, of course, there's another party involved. This is diplomatic word salad. He admits Nothing has changed on the Ukrainian side, nothing has changed on the Russian side, and yet a U.S. envoy is heading to Moscow as if repetition itself will somehow produce a breakthrough. But Russia has stated its terms again and again, directly and publicly. President Putin has been absolutely clear. Russia will achieve all the objectives of the special military operation: demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification, recognition of the 4 new Russian regions within their full administrative borders, a neutral and non-NATO Ukraine, and guarantees for the rights of Russian speakers. These terms have been on the table since at least mid-2024 and have been reaffirmed repeatedly. They have not changed. Russia has said it will realize these goals either through negotiations or, if the West refuses, on the battlefield. So what exactly is the American envoy going to ask in Moscow? Will you reconsider your clearly stated objectives, even though the military balance has shifted further in your favor since you first announced them? Why would Moscow do that? Why would a side that is advancing, consolidating territory, and holding the initiative throw away its leverage to rescue Western leaders from the consequences of their own arrogance? The uncomfortable truth is this: for more than a century, and especially since 1991, Western elites have grown accustomed to dictating the terms of every post-war settlement. From Versailles to the post-Cold War expansion of NATO, they assumed they would always be in the position of the dominant power, always setting the rules, always deciding where other nations' borders begin and end. They ignored every Russian complaint, every warning, every signal that NATO expansion and the militarization of Ukraine was a red line. They did it because they thought there would never be a serious consequence. Now, Rubio and others talk about wanting a settlement that makes Ukraine safe forever, with long-term prosperity, a rebuilt economy, and even an 800,000-strong army. That is pure fantasy. The cumulative effect of Western policy has been to destroy the Ukrainian state as a viable, independent actor. We pushed Kyiv to reject negotiations in 2014 and 2015. We encouraged Kyiv to walk away from serious talks in March 2022. We cheered on a disastrous 2023 offensive that cost Ukraine enormous manpower and equipment for negligible gains. At each stage of Russian escalation, we doubled down. More weapons, more sanctions, more rhetoric. We did nothing to stop the loss of Mariupol. We did nothing when Ukrainian forces were ground down in Bakhmut. We did nothing substantive to halt Russian advances across a 1,000-kilometer front. Instead, we insisted that Ukraine press on, regardless of casualties or territory lost. The result is a country whose men are being bled dry, whose economy is shattered, and whose future depends almost entirely on external subsidies. Under those conditions, proposing an 800,000-strong Ukrainian army is ludicrous. Who will pay for it? With what tax base? On what industrial foundation? Even if the war stopped tomorrow, it would take at least a decade and massive foreign support just to make Ukraine partially functional again. Yet Western politicians talk as though we can simply sign a piece of paper, pour in a few more billions, and somehow conjure up a prosperous, heavily armed, permanently secure Ukraine standing as a bulwark against Russia. This is not strategy, it is escapism. Wars do not end because one side declares its ideal end state at a press conference. Wars end when both sides either agree to terms or when the stronger side imposes its will on the weaker. We are now in the latter situation. The side that clearly holds the military advantage, Russia, is the one that will dictate the fundamentals of any settlement. If the fighting continues, the West can refuse to accept that, but reality does not ask for our consent. Could all of this have been avoided? Absolutely. A genuine implementation of the Minsk agreements in 2015 would almost certainly have prevented this war. Serious engagement with Russia's December 2021 security proposals could have led to an arrangement that protected Russian strategic interests while preserving a neutral, intact Ukraine. Instead, at every juncture, 2015, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, Western leaders chose escalation and denial over compromise. Each refusal pushed Russia to adapt its goals and expand its control. The only thing Russia has changed since 2022 is the amount of territory it now claims as its own. And it will keep moving west, keep grinding down Ukrainian manpower, keep destroying infrastructure and military capability until its core objectives are met either at the negotiating table or by force of arms. You can rebuild bridges, roads, and apartment blocks. You cannot bring back the dead. Layered on top of this strategic blindness is an equally corrosive moral hypocrisy. President Trump, in a remarkably understated phrase, admits there is a corruption situation in Ukraine that is not helpful. That's putting it mildly. Zelensky's closest associates, his political right and left hands, have been exposed in major scandals. One has resigned, another has fled. The corruption is not marginal. It is systemic and obvious. Everyone in Brussels, Washington, and London knows it. Yet Zelensky is still treated like a heroic defender of democracy, paraded through Western capitals, feted by parliaments, applauded by elites who know perfectly well what is happening inside his regime. They turn a blind eye to the shuttering of opposition parties, the suppression of religious institutions deemed politically inconvenient, the closure of media channels that depart from the official line, the arrests of dissidents, and they still dare to call this democracy. Compare that to the double standards applied to Russia. Western leaders howl about authoritarianism in Moscow while endorsing a de facto one-man rule in Kyiv under indefinite martial law, without elections, without real pluralism, and with enormous corruption at the very top. The United States held an election during its civil war. Russia held a presidential election during this conflict. Ukraine did not. Yet Kyiv is the one showered with democratic accolades. This is not about defending freedom or human rights. It is about protecting Western elites and their interests. The corruption in Ukraine is tolerated because it channels money and influence to the right people in the West as well as in Kyiv. Contracts, reconstruction funds, military procurement, energy deals, all of these are profit streams. The blood of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians is the cost of doing business. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian people, the ones actually burying their sons, living without power, watching their cities crumble, are effectively powerless. Many do not want to lose. Many feel genuine hostility toward Russia, but above all, they want the killing to stop. They want a government that puts their survival above grand geopolitical fantasies. They want leadership that can cut a realistic deal and start rebuilding their country instead of sacrificing it on the altar of Western prestige. I've been in touch with people inside Ukraine. The picture they paint is bitter and tragic. Ordinary Ukrainians know they are trapped between a ruthless Russian military machine and a cynical Western political class that is willing to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. They know that Zelensky is not accountable to them, but to outside sponsors. They see him flying around Europe, making the same speeches, repeating the same lines, while their lives disintegrate. They understand, often better than Western citizens, that their country is being used. None of this means Russia is innocent or saintly. War is brutal. Russia has done things in this conflict that are harsh and ugly, but that is not the point. The point is capability and consequence. If you are serious about morality, you must apply it first to yourself. You cannot destabilize entire regions, march military blocs to other nations' borders, support coups, arm proxy forces, and then act shocked when the targeted country eventually responds. As long as Western leaders refuse to look in the mirror, as long as they cling to their illusions about permanent dominance and rules-based orders that they themselves constantly violate, Russia will feel fully justified in every step it takes. And we will drift, step by step, toward a much larger catastrophe of our own making. Even if the war stays conventional, a direct NATO-Russia confrontation could easily kill millions across Europe. If it goes nuclear, the consequences are almost beyond imagining. There is absolutely no legitimate reason for the West to stumble into that kind of war. None. This is not about defending Brussels or Berlin or Washington from some imminent Russian invasion. Russia has neither the intent nor the capacity to conquer Europe. It is about ego, sunk costs, and the refusal of Western elites to admit they miscalculated about Russia, about Ukraine, and about the limits of their own power. The delusion that Russia must submit, that Moscow must eventually play ball on Western terms, is not just wrong, it is dangerous. It is killing Ukrainians today, and it risks killing Europeans tomorrow. The only rational course is to strip away the propaganda, accept that Russia holds the upper hand in this war, acknowledge that Western policies helped create this disaster, and negotiate on the basis of reality, not fantasy. Until that happens, Russia will continue to advance, Ukraine will continue to bleed, and the West will march deeper into a crisis it started but no longer controls.